Greetings, everybody. Welcome to Noetic. I am CJ, and I am joined by
Jordan.
And today we're going to be looking at an essay from Michel de Montaigne's essays. We're in book 1 at the moment, and we're going to be looking at the 27th in that book. And the essay is titled, "It is folly to measure the true and the false by our own capacity." Again, it is folly to measure the true and the false by our own capacity. So, Jordan, I'll let you get us started.
All right, so before we dive into the heart of the text, it seems germane for us to touch on a few things. And in this essay, Montaigne's thoughts as a skeptic are especially pronounced. So it'd be helpful for us to discuss ever so briefly on skepticism in general.
Sure, and I can maybe flesh that out a little bit. So when we're talking about skepticism, we're talking about Pyrrhonian skepticism. And Pyrrho is the founder of skepticism. He was a Greek philosopher between 360 and 270 BC, and he accompanied Alexander the Great on his explorations throughout East Asia. And when he came back, he established the school of skepticism. Now, he didn't write anything down necessarily, but what we know of his thoughts and beliefs are recorded by many other skeptics after him. And one in particular was Sextus Empiricus, who was a philosopher as well as a doctor. And out of the many books he wrote, what he called outlines of Pyrrhonian skepticism. And that is what Montaigne used in his own time to understand skepticism itself and to understand Pyrrho's thoughts, as well as Sextus's and other skeptics' thoughts. And he would have been looking at a translation from another Frenchman named Henri Estienne's French translation, which came out around 1562. And I think it's important to note that Montaigne actually started these essays around 1570. So that gives about 8 years or more of actually just sitting with skepticism and thinking about those thoughts and perhaps going even beyond Sextus's work and going into other works about skepticism. So that's a start.
Yeah, and I think before we get into the text, one thing that I wanted to go over is a particular term. And it applies to how Montaigne writes and presents his arguments in the essay. And it's called in utraquem partem, which means on either side of the case. And this style of laying out an argument is notable because it complements his skeptical point of view.
And I think we'll see that in the essay when he goes into various examples. But let's actually get into the essay.
So I thought that this was helpful, at least with the in utraquem partem, was because we've seen this before, right? The style of what we called previously point and counterpoint. So I thought that was a helpful technical term for us to go over before we get into it. But yeah, let's dive right in.
Yeah.
And Montaigne opens this essay with making a couple of distinctions of not knowing things, right? And being ignorant. And so he makes the distinction: being simple-minded is a readiness to believe anything. Hey, CJ.
What?
Did you know the sky screen?
No, but I know now.
Okay, great. So that would be sort of Montaigne's, example of being simple-minded. And then being ignorant, he says, is a readiness to be convinced of anything. Hey, CJ, did you know that the sky is green?
No. Why?
Well, didn't you see that Nat Geo published an article saying the sky is green now? Studies show the sky is green.
What? Okay. I think I believe now. I trust.
Crazy, right? Science. And so that would be Montaigne's definition of ignorance. But then Montaigne says that there's a more active ignorance, and that is holding a certain belief or an opinion, digging your heels in, and being unwilling to entertain any other perspectives. So the motive between the more passive forms of either being simple-minded or ignorant is being impressionable and not having enough evidence or being uneducated. And we've seen that in his prior essays, right, with prognostications, where he says he doesn't fault peasants or children or maybe women who aren't educated in believing sort of these superstitions. But he does hold people accountable for when they are actively ignorant. And the reason why he chides this second group of people so much is because he used to be one of those, right? He used to be a naysayer.
Yeah, and what was he naysaying?
And we've seen this before, but Montaigne used to scoff at these stories of witches and ghosts and predictions and all these prognostications. And he used to just say, that is just hogwash. These are fairy tales, fables. Not going to believe them. Like, no thanks.
But the joke was on him, right? Because he says, well, maybe I should be the one pitied instead. Yeah,
exactly. And what's interesting is that Montaigne doesn't arrive at this conclusion because he has an encounter with the ghost and now he's seen the light and he's changed his mind about all of this. He says that it's reason that led him to this conclusion.
Yeah, and I think it would be great to touch on the quote where he says reason guides him to this conclusion. And what he says is the following, quote, "Reason has taught me that thus absolutely to condemn a thing as false and impossible is to imagine our own brains to possess the privilege of knowing the bounds and limits of God's will and the power of our mother nature."
Mm-hmm. Right. So when people are dismissive of those certain things, then they make the assumption that they know the edges of God's works and the bounds of nature. Mm-hmm. And he thinks that it's crazy for human beings to drag the lofty divines of the universe into our narrow and mundane levels of understanding, rather than acknowledge the possibility of supernatural phenomena.
Yeah, and this goes right into a tenet of skepticism. So Montaigne is almost following what he read from Sextus and Pyrrho, where skepticism, at the heart of it, they discuss how our own sense perceptions neither tell us the truth nor lie, that they are simply there, and for us to try to garner truth from them, whether it be through observation or via thinking, is ill-founded because the tools that we're using are faulty already.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So Montaigne is going right into that mind frame by saying, well, you're already boxing yourself in.
Right. And so when we come across something that we cannot reason away, right, that we cannot pull apart through rationale, that there's this tendency for people to label things as either monstrous or completely miraculous. And it's not, and Montaigne says that it's not knowledge that makes us unafraid of things, but it's really familiarity. And to your point of how our senses are faulty instruments, is his comparison of confusing an ocean, with a river, because the only thing that you've seen has been the creek in your backyard. So if you only see a little stream your entire life, and then you see a river, you're like, wow, this has got to be what an ocean is, because this thing is massive. Right? Yeah, so that's really interesting that you brought that point up of the senses misleading us, for sure. And then, so Montaigne's antidote to this, right, is our confidence in our capabilities and our senses, is that Montaigne thinks that people need to tone down their confidence in their abilities and place more respect in nature.
Yeah, so this goes to something that skeptics also believe, where Montaigne says if we can't really be convinced of something on either side, we should, quote, at least remain in suspense,
Yeah.
right? That we shouldn't even choose anything and just be in the middle. Now, skeptics had a term for this, almost a kind of like a one-word antidote, and it was the Greek word apoke, which means I suspend judgment. So if Jordan asked me, okay, well, what do you think of the stock market? Is it going to rise or is it going to fall? I would say, epoche. I suspend judgment. And maybe to use a example from Sextus Empiricus, he gives us other ways to say epoche. You can say, well, I cannot say which of the things proposed I find convincing and which I should not find convincing, right? Where you don't take a side, but you just let both sides exist as they are.
Right.
And what I think is really important to note is that Montaigne took the term epoche and inscribed it on little medals that he could carry around with him, where he could place in his home. And that it was almost for us like a tattoo or any kind of way to remember or to really inscribe an idea into your own psyche. So Montaigne's already putting skepticism into practice by trying to say, do what he's talking about, do what he's writing about, which is to suspend judgment, to have more reverence, as you said, for Mother Nature and for God and for the things that are beyond our own capacity.
Right, and he thinks it's stupid to pass judgment because it implies, people know what's the limits of, what the physical limitations of our world are. And if people could understand what's impossible versus unusual and discern what events are against the course of nature and what's really the opinions of men, then we'd have this happy medium, right? Nothing too much.
Yeah.
This sort of happy medium. And he gives a couple examples, right, of certain leaders predicting events, and that might be enough to stop us in our tracks, that might not, but he does give a couple examples of Augustine, right, and cites a couple of miracles. And he says that, well, those might be more credible because that they had two witnesses who were bishops to account for those miracles.
So this is his skepticism in action, right? Because we can just say miracles don't exist. What do you mean? And he says, okay, well, maybe we can have certain examples that are obvious. But then there are those
right,
which aren't. Yeah. When they have people that we know to be good people, and we would feel as if they couldn't really lie to us in some regard. And then that sounds like we're being gullible, but I think maybe Montaigne is trying to make it more difficult.
Men of good judgment and good character and some learning, right? And so he seems iffy on the relics of Saint Hilary, right? Working all these miracles. But the Augustine miracles seem a little bit more credible because it's Augustine, who's a learned man, a good man, claiming these, and it's substantiated. And it's interesting because he goes on to say that it's really dangerous for us to loathe or hold in contempt what we can't understand. And this is the point in the essay where he brings in Catholicism and Protestantism. And he touches on it. And he says that Catholics don't realize that they actually really energize their Protestant detractors when they abandon the parts of Catholic theology on the grounds of seeming more compromising or sort of reasonable. And sometimes the articles of faith that Catholics are willing to dismiss or abandon are actually really unwittingly very important points of doctrine. And again, Montaigne makes this critique because he sort of, it's bolstered by his own experience, because he said that, based off of whatever was convenient for him, he used to pick and choose certain practices and beliefs, and he would discard the ones that he found strange or odd or not relevant. And it's not really for Montaigne until he encounters some scholars and some men of the church that set him straight and say, well, here are these things to consider when you want to toss some of these beliefs overboard, and everything has a reason.
Mm-hmm.
And with Montaigne, he makes, in my opinion, a pretty bold statement when he says, you either have to commit to the Catholic Church or separate from it.
Yeah, and I think we have to look at it through that lens of skepticism, right? Mm-hmm. Because what he's implying, it seems, is that we have the arrogance to cherry pick, right? To choose what we deem as right, that we know more than the church and we can understand how faith works and how our relationship with God works in general. But Montaigne is saying that that's just another form of what you were talking about, of active ignorance, right? So he wants to say, okay, well, that's just another form of that, and we have to get rid of it. And if it's beyond our understanding, then we should accept it anyway through faith.
Right, exactly. And then that's like that trust that you place
in
God. Yeah, and that reverence for, or respect for the authority of the church. And I think this is one of my favorite parts, where Montaigne points out that we just people in general tend to forget our own short-sightedness, and we forget our own contradictory judgment.
So it's almost in a sense that we're always going back and forth between things.
Yeah, I mean, we're constantly blundering in our judgment.
Going from truth, going to false, going from fable, going to reality.
Yeah.
Back and forth, and that's just...
We're kind of unaware of it.
Yeah. But maybe that's what he's trying to make us know.
Yeah, I think he's trying to call that to our attention, and his final point is that we have this excessive pride that leads us to sort of meddle in the affairs of the universe and kind of poke and prod it with a stick, and then we have this curiosity that compels us to stay mired in these affairs in the hope of finding some sort of conclusion.
Yeah, and that goes right
for
against...
our own egos, essentially.
Yeah, and it goes right against nothing too much, right? Because those are excesses. Those are trying to go to one side or another. And that's not that nice skeptic, just middle ground that Montaigne is trying to aspire to, at least, or that the skeptics are trying to aspire to.
Right. So
Montaigne ends with that. And I don't know about you, Jordan, but when I first read this and thought about skepticism, it left me wondering why anyone would want to be skeptic in this way. Because, okay, well, I can't really believe one thing or another thing. I can't trust my senses. I can't attain truth of any nature. Where does this leave me?
Yeah, how do you go about the world? How do you navigate the world if nothing is true? Like, what are your markers?
Yeah, or how is this supposed to be a consoling philosophy at all?
Right. Like, what's the good of it?
What is the good of it? And I think it just took us a little more time to talk about it and understand it through other sources and just through looking deeper into skepticism. And I found a really wonderful biography by Sarah Bakewell called How to Live, which is a biography of Montaigne through asking that very question, how to live. And one chapter of the book is saying, well, question everything. And it goes into the connection of skepticism and Montaigne. And she addresses this point because I think it's a very obvious and very considerate to think about in some way, where it's just, oh, well, if I can't believe in anything, what do I believe, or how is this even consoling at all? And she addresses it accordingly when she says that skepticism might seem a dead end, closing off all possibility of knowing anything, since nothing can be measured against anything else, but it can also open up a new way of living. It makes everything more complicated and more interesting. The world becomes a vast, multidimensional landscape in which everything, every point of view, must be taken into account, so that the world has all of these different sides, and we take on that technique that you addressed in the beginning, right, of that rhetorical, just going to one side, going to another, seeing the good in one side, seeing the bad, seeing the good in the other side, and seeing the bad, but still not really choosing one.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And we've talked a lot, it seems we use the word balance a lot, right? Of not going to one side or another. And I think a word that we can associate with balance is peace, if I would say so, or repose. If we're not trying to believe in one thing or fight for another belief, then we can almost live in this harmony. And Sarah Bakewell addresses this too, and I'll end with a final quotation from her, in which she addresses this form of tranquility, where she writes, "The skeptics," quote, "did this," that is the skepticism itself, "not to unsettle themselves profoundly and throw themselves into a paranoid vortex of doubt, but to attain a condition of relaxation about everything." Mm-hmm. And I think that leads into what you find maybe as a consolation of skepticism. Right?
Yeah, and I think that for me, initially I was like, oh man, like how do you navigate the world when you can't feel like you can't trust anything? But I'll let Frampton speak for himself, because I think he said it best. In short, Montaigne's skepticism arrives at sympathy rather than certainty, seeing our most obstinate beliefs as simply grounded in habit. So I don't think it's a ways to sort of mistrust the world and look at everything that you encounter with suspicion, but I think it's a way for us to get outside of our own heads and to look at things in a more fair and balanced view, which might bring us some sort of peace of mind.
I love it. Well, thanks so much, Jordan, for
Thanks, EJ.
Talking about this as always. And if you all want to listen to more, then you can find more videos on YouTube. You can find stuff on SoundCloud. We also have an app that you can download via the App Store
or Google Play.
And with that, we'll let you all just
suspend judgment and make your own inquiries.
Okay, everybody. Thanks a lot.
See you soon. Take care.